As a useful framework for everything we will be studying this semester, we will be relying on a classic paper from 1964 by Herbert Packer called Two Models of the Criminal Process. Let's first situate our course in the criminal process by looking at this useful chart from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. This is the sequence of events in the criminal justice system, and you can see on the left in the light blue the whole process covered by criminal justice investigation, the course looking at the police investigation process. Our journey begins once the file is transferred from the police to the prosecution. We'll be looking at the charges filed and at several of the initial appearances and screens that a case goes through on its way to trial. You will note that when we move over to the purple, to the adjudication process, there is a split between the cases that go to trial and the cases that are being resolved through guilty pleas. This diagram is misleading in that it doesn't give you the share of cases, but you should know that the vast majority of cases in the criminal process do go through a guilty plea process and therefore don't ever come to trial. You could be mistaken for not knowing this if you watched a lot of Law and Order and saw a lot of trials, but only a handful of cases go to criminal trial. After a conviction, all cases go to sentencing, whether they ended in a finding in a verdict by a jury or in a guilty plea, followed by the transfer of the defendant, if necessary, to the correctional system to serve their sentence. In looking at how this process works, it's useful to think about the two models of the criminal process as posed by Packer. Packer posited these models not as realistic descriptions of what actually happens in the system, but rather as two Weberian ideal types, just philosophical notions at the two ends of a spectrum. And the models that he posited were the crime control model and the due process model. Let's look at each of them in turn. The best metaphor for discussing the crime control model is an assembly line designed to process a large number of items or products in a limited amount of time and with the most cheap and efficient way of doing so. You guessed it, the basic model, the basic value behind the crime control model is efficiency. And because of that, it consists very heavily of a screening process. In the crime control model, a lot of authority and power is being given to law enforcement. Their role is to find out as quickly and efficiently as possible what happened. Then there's a lot of authority given to the prosecution, which is the main screening mechanism in the crime control model. The prosecutor has a pivotal role in screening and directing cases and in shunting any case that doesn't go through a simple and straightforward resolution away from the criminal process. This is done through what Herbert Packer calls the presumption of guilt. You might have heard about the presumption of innocence in studying evidence or 1L criminal law. The presumption of guilt is very different from the presumption of innocence. The presumption of innocence, as you've learned, is basically a principle of evidence, saying that in order to find someone guilty, the state has to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. By contrast, the presumption of guilt is a statistical rule. Basically, what it says is, empirically speaking, most of the people that have been found to have committed the crime by the police and whose cases are being prosecuted by the prosecution are probably guilty if the police and the prosecution did their job properly. Because of that, we can assume that any case that remains in the system is a case of somebody who is factually guilty. And because of that, we don't have to resort to expensive and inefficient trial protections. These just jam the wheels of the giant machine and impede its quick and efficient process. This also means that in this model, finality is key. It's very, very important for the cases to actually end rather than result in endless post-conviction reviews. By contrast to the crime control model, the best metaphor for the due process model is a very detailed artisan workshop in which a lot of attention is given to quality control. The worst possible thing that can happen in the due process model is a mistake, meaning an innocent person who has been found convicted and sentenced to a prison sentence. This could result in an unjust stigma and in deprivation of liberty, which is the worst imaginable outcome according to this model. This model is also deeply concerned about bias and about equality, about the fact that some people, namely poor people and people of color, tend to be on the receiving end of these kinds of mistakes more often. Because of that, the due process model prioritizes protections. It prioritizes the presumption of innocence and a variety of procedural safeguards to make sure that nobody is railroaded into a conviction for something they didn't do. In this model, as opposed to the crime control model, trial is crucial because that is the way to control the biases that law enforcement and the prosecution might have. The concern is that the tunnel vision and the motivation of police officers or prosecutors might be to resolve the case quickly and thus render it vulnerable to mistakes. Because of all this, in the due process model, defense counsel plays a pivotal part because defense counsel offers a variety of tools and opportunities to correct mistakes by employing all of the rights and constitutional protections to benefit the criminal defendant. Of course, in this model, there will also be opportunities to correct mistakes post-conviction. So this model will emphasize the importance of things like appeals or habeas corpus writs. Over the years, many people have proposed alternative models or additional models to Packer's models. For example, Albert Altshuler in 1967, criticizing Packer, says there really aren't two models, there really is only one model, and that's the crime control model. Everything else is just fanciful imagination. Following this line of thinking, Malcolm Feely in 1977 said the two models are not made of the same cloth. Because while the due process is doctrinal or aspirational as it's written in the Constitution, the crime control model describes more accurately what actually happens in the criminal justice system. Other people also propose models that provide more importance to victims as a party to the criminal justice process, either a punitive party that collaborates with the prosecution or a non-punitive party that participates in a variety of restorative justice processes, or models involving an emphasis on uncovering innocence and helping prevent miscarriages of justice.